Hey guys! This week we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to ponder a mystery. The most well-known mystery in medieval history probably. The princes in the tower. I've had so many interesting discussions with so many of you about this. I thought it was time we decided to be armchair detectives. Now hopefully you all know I like to see all sides of a historical argument, so we're going to try and be as fair as possible and give all theories consideration. The princes in the tower were, of course, Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury. Their father Edward IV died on the 9th of April 1483, and his death left a bit of a problem, as Edward V was still only 12 years old. This meant he would need a regent to manage his affairs until he reached the age of majority, and his father had become king as a result of the chaotic Wars of the Roses. This meant their family's hold on the crown was wobbly at best, and especially in the hands of a young boy. Edward V's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, understood that whoever controlled her son controlled the throne and therefore secured their own position. Edward IV had asked, before dying, for his younger brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, to be his son's regent and Lord Protector of England. But Elizabeth feared what might happen if she allowed this. Richard and the Woodvilles had never got along, and they knew if he became regent, they would be removed swiftly from court, and they even feared Edward V would be turned against them. Elizabeth sent her brother Anthony Woodville, 2nd Earl Rivers, and one of her sons from her first marriage, Sir Richard Grey, half-brother to the princes, to bring Edward to her in London from where he was staying at Ludlow Castle. However, by this point Richard III had heard about his brother's death and was probably more than a little bit ticked off that Elizabeth hadn't bothered to tell him, likely to buy her family more time. He set forth for London from Midland Castle in Yorkshire, meeting up with Edward V at Stony Stratford. Richard initially pretended to be fine with also meeting Anthony Woodville and Richard Grey before locking them into their rooms at the inn and later arresting them, supposedly for their plans to kill the king and take power for themselves. The pair would later be executed by Richard further north. Young Edward must have been pretty surprised to meet with his uncle Richard, but even more shocked at the news that his family members were planning on apparently murdering him. The pair went to London, and Edward was placed in the Tower of London to await his coronation, all very traditional. But the coronation was postponed from the 4th to the 25th of May, and perhaps no one thought anything of it at first. After all, there was a lot to prepare, and Edward IV's death had been a sudden one. Elizabeth Woodville must have been horrified to learn what had happened to her brother and other son, and perhaps was nervous enough of keeping Edward safe that when Richard suggested Edward's brother Richard of Shrewsbury join his brother in the tower to keep him company, she agreed. Richard of Shrewsbury went into the tower with his brother on the 16th of June, and this was the last time Elizabeth would see either of her sons from her second marriage again. Things suddenly moved very quickly. On the 22nd of June, Dr. Ralph Shah gave a sermon declaring Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury were illegitimate, as their father Edward IV had apparently been engaged to another woman before marrying their mother. This apparently made the marriage invalid. It didn't seem to matter that the woman in question, Eleanor Butler, was dead and so couldn't speak for herself. Richard's best mate at the time and right-hand man, Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, then addressed Parliament and suggested the only real choice for the throne was, drumroll please, Richard himself. The Council and Parliament reluctantly agreed on the 26th of June, and by the 6th of July, Richard was crowned as Richard III of England, with his wife Anne as Queen Consort. Parliament would later ratify the decision the princes were illegitimate with Titulus Regius. From this point onwards, the boys would be seen less and less. Richard will have been very certain of how unstable his position was, and letting the boys go would have been impossible. Dominic Mancini, an Italian friar who visited London in the summer of 1483, reported that Prince Edward was apparently visited regularly by a doctor, and that the young boy was sick and feared he was going to die. Some people said they had seen the boys playing together in the gardens of the Tower, and in July, a failed rescue attempt was made to free them from the guarded fortress. After September, there were no more sightings of the princes. Rumours abounded of their deaths, and when Elizabeth heard about this, she was inconsolable. Their disappearance would remain uncertain until August 1485, when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth and took the English crown, becoming Henry VII. He ordered the Tower be searched for the boys, but there was no sign of them. It was widely assumed the boys had been murdered by their uncle Richard, and when bones of 2 young boys were discovered in 1674 in the White Tower, it was suggested those bones were those of the princes. In 1789, however, another pair of small remains were found by workmen carrying out repairs to St. George's Chapel in Windsor. They were found in an adjoining vault to that of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, and at the time were thought to be of their other children, George and Margaret, who both died young. But their coffins were actually found elsewhere in the chapel, and so far, no one knows the identity of the other 2 sets of remains. But what really happened to the princes, and who was responsible? But all this is with the reminder, of course, that anything is conjecture, and we'll never really find out what happened probably. But that's not going to stop us trying. Okay, so really there's only 2 possible explanations for what happened to the princes in the Tower. The first is that they were indeed murdered. The second is that they were freed from the Tower somehow. We're going to look at both of these possibilities and the possible reasons behind it. But first, we have to line up our suspects. The most obvious suspect is Richard III. He was the boy's uncle, but he had means, motive, and opportunity. The second suspect is Henry Stafford. Now, he was Richard III's right-hand man, but at some point relations soured between them. He may have also had his own motives for doing away with the boys. The third suspect is Henry VII. He didn't really have the means or the opportunity, but he certainly had the motive. When he married Elizabeth of York, revoking title as Regis would have meant the boys, if they were still alive, would come to the throne before him. And the final suspect, and probably the least likely, is Margaret Beaufort. Now, she was Henry VII's mother, and she would have done anything for her son. But there isn't really any evidence linking her to the crime, but we're going to go into that. So let's start with our most obvious suspect first. Richard III was the only person who had access to the boys, and no one, including Edward V's doctor, went in or out without his say-so. Edward's doctor, probably a man named John Argentine, was one of the last people to see the young king-to-be alive. According to Mancini, Argentine reported back that Edward seemed like a victim prepared for sacrifice, and that he sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance because he believed that death was facing him. Some people have interpreted this as being proof Edward suspected he might be murdered, others that he was ill, and still others who think the whole thing was nonsense. Richard was king only by declaring Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury illegitimate on the basis that their parents' marriage was invalid, and as such, the children of the union were bastards. This all rested on their father, Edward IV, being unable to speak up from beyond the grave, as was the woman he had supposedly been betrothed to before Elizabeth Woodville, Eleanor Butler. However, while Richard declaring the boys illegitimate should have been enough, it was a bit flimsy. Firstly, no one can really have given the supposed betrothal to Eleanor Butler any real serious thought. An engagement was not a marriage, and many betrothals were broken off amicably and otherwise during the Middle Ages. But even if someone did subscribe to the idea of Edward and Little Richard being illegitimate, it still didn't actually prevent them from taking the throne. There were enough examples in history of the sons of kings and their unmarried lovers taking the throne to make Richard III nervous. Killing the boys off would have meant the way was free and clear for Richard to push himself in as main heir for the throne, and he certainly had the means. He was away in York when the princes disappeared, but he could have easily got someone else to do it for him. The main person put forward for this task is one Sir James Tyrrell, who was a knight that had fought for the House of York on many occasions. He was arrested in 1502 by Henry VII for trying to help another Yorkist claimant to the throne, and under torture apparently admitted to the murder of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury under Richard III's orders. Pretty cut and dry, right? Why are we even debating this, Miranda? Well, there are some holes in this theory. The first obvious one is that the information from James Tyrrell was obtained under torture. We know that any information under torture is suspect. Would you admit to anything to make pain stop? Of course you would. So while we have a confession, we have to consider one obtained under duress. The second problem is that Richard didn't actually have a totally clear route to the throne after the death of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, in a manner of speaking. His older brother, George, Duke of Clarence, had had 2 children, a daughter named Margaret and a son named Edward, who was the 17th Earl of Warwick. Now, when George had been executed by Edward IV, yes, his own brother, he was attainted, which theoretically meant all of his lands and property were forfeit to the crown. His son couldn't inherit them, and therefore Edward of Warwick wasn't in line for the throne. However, an attainder could easily be reversed by Parliament after the death of the person attainted, and often was. So Edward could have had a shot at being King of England in theory. Added to this was the fact that Richard III actually treated his other nephew, Edward of Warwick, quite well, knighting him at York in September 1483. According to Mancini, he also had the boy placed in the household of his wife, Queen Anne, although there isn't much evidence surrounding this. Another hole in the theory of Richard as the murderer is the fact that simply making the boys disappear created more problems for him. If he knew the princes were dead from either a murder or illness, it would have been easy to claim they had died of a sickness. It was known Edward's doctor had visited the boys, and showing their lifeless bodies and arranging an elaborate funeral for them would have actually made everything easier for Richard. By keeping it secret, if that is what happened, rumours grew and allowed Henry Tudor to grow in popularity. The only way knowing the boys were dead and keeping them secret makes sense is if it was really murder and it was botched. It's not a nice thing to think about, but if the murder was particularly violent, this could be a reason for keeping their bodies secret. Although this seems to be less likely as well, as there was no need for a violent death. Okay, so Richard III is still a suspect, but there are some problems with him being the murderer or the orchestrator of the murders. But what if someone close to him did away with the boys? This is where our second suspect comes in, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. Henry Stafford was at first Richard's right-hand man. During Edward IV's reign, the Duke of Buckingham was set up in February 1466 to marry Catherine Woodville, the youngest sister of Elizabeth Woodville. Now, at the time, Henry was only 10 and Catherine was 8, and he would later claim he was forced into the marriage. He believed his wife was beneath him, as she had only been gentry at the time of her birth. Despite this apparent dislike of his young wife, they had 5 children together, and Henry didn't say anything about the marriage until after Edward IV was dead. Stafford then firmly hitched his wagon to Richard's cause and helped him ascend the throne of England. The two were pretty much best friends forever until around October 1483, when Stafford rebelled against Richard and switched sides to align with Henry Tudor and his mother Margaret Beaufort. The reasons as to why Henry fell out with Richard are very murky, but there is some suggestion they may have been connected to the disappearance of the boys. So Stafford himself had a link to the crown through being descended from John of Gaunt and Thomas of Woodstock, both sons of Edward III, and there is some suggestion he decided to have a go for the throne himself. Why not? Everyone else was doing it. He may have seen getting rid of the princes as a way to get a step closer to the throne. However, there are lots of problems with this, namely that best mate Richard was now king, and the boys had been declared illegitimate anyway, unless Stafford was planning on also bumping Richard off, for which there is no evidence, or he was acting on behalf of Henry VII. We'll look at that later as well. Alternatively, Stafford may have murdered the two boys to make himself look good in Richard's eyes if he thought it was something that would score him some points. This is posited as a possible reason for their falling out. That Richard found out the boys were dead on his return from the north and was furious with Stafford. But then, why not go public about Stafford and clear his own name? The other possibility is that Henry had spirited the boys away to the continent, more on that later, and Richard was pretty mad that they weren't where he had left them. But either of these scenarios also presents a new problem. If Henry Stafford wanted Richard out of the way, and he had successfully made the princes vanish through either means, why not publicly proclaim Richard a murderer? There were already rumours, and it probably would have been enough to tip people against the king. But in support of the Stafford theory, he was placed in command of the capital in Richard's absence while the king travelled north. This meant that he had the means and the opportunity to get to the princes, and there is suggestion that he and James Tyrrell, remember him, conspired to kill the boys together. Henry's later rebellion against Richard is also odd without context, as the two had got on well until that point. An interesting document was also found in the 80s in the College of Arms in London, dating from the early 1500s, in which it was written that the murder of the princes was the vice of the Duke of Buckingham. Unfortunately for Henry Stafford, his rebellion was a failure. He fled in disguise near Wem in Shropshire, but was discovered and brought before Richard III. With no trial, Stafford was executed on the 2nd of November 1483 for his treason, and was no longer able to tell anyone if he did know anything. The theory of Stafford as the murderer, at least on his own volition, isn't widely accepted. However, it's possible he was acting on behalf of Richard III. Confused yet? It's possible Stafford was supposed to do away with the boys when Richard was away in the north in order to give the king an alibi, and then Richard would announce their death by illness, give them a lavish and suitable funeral, and move on. But what if something went wrong? What if, as mentioned above, the murder turned violent and the boys' bodies could therefore not be shown? It could also be a possible reason for Richard's anger with his previous best buddy. Okay, so we're down to 2 suspects now, and Henry Stafford is not off the hook, especially as he might have been involved with suspect number 3, Henry Tudor, later to become Henry VII. Henry Tudor had not actually originally set out to be king. Exiled to Brittany with his uncle Jasper Tudor, his mother Margaret Beaufort had been petitioning on his behalf for his rehabilitation to England and his rightful title of Earl of Richmond through his father. She was adept at keeping herself neutral and on everyone's good side, and through 4 marriages and lots of knowing when not to speak, Margaret had got in very well with Edward IV Elizabeth Woodville and their family. She was petitioning Edward IV just before he died, and there was little hope of negotiating with Richard when he took the throne. As Richard distanced himself more from the nobility connected to the Woodvilles, Elizabeth Woodville, who was corresponding still with Margaret, suggested a marriage between her daughter Elizabeth of York and Henry Tudor. This was only if he took the crown of England and reversed the Titulus Regius. In exchange, Elizabeth would help with funds and men to fight for Henry's cause. Henry declared publicly on Christmas Day 1483 at Rennes Cathedral that he was going to marry Elizabeth of York. This obviously also meant he was going to make a play for the crown. This was mostly going to be through the old crown by conquest route, but Henry did also have a weak claim to the throne through his mother, who was a great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt through his legitimised grandson, John Beaufort. By the summer of 1485, Henry had gathered enough men and forces to invade England, and he made his way through Wales first, where he had support, and then on towards Leicester. His forces met Richard III's near Bosworth on the 22nd of August, and he was victorious. After claiming the crown, Henry bumped off a lot of claimants to the throne, including John of Gloucester, who was Richard III's illegitimate son. It has been suggested he decided to do the same with the princes in the Tower, to make sure they were gone before marrying their older sister. He didn't marry Elizabeth of York until the following year, and revoking Titulus Regius would mean she was once again considered a legitimate daughter of Edward IV, but that would also count for Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury. Henry wasn't able to get to the boys before 1485 personally, so either would have to do it shortly after becoming king or get someone else to do it for him, like Henry Stafford. But again, there are big holes in this argument too. If the princes really had been hanging out in the Tower of London for 2 years, why did Richard III never bring them out and show them off? It would have immediately quashed any rumours. The fact he didn't means they probably weren't there, however that happened. And so, if Henry Tudor was responsible for their deaths, he would have had to do it through a third party. But again, if he knew the princes were dead, why not publicly paint Richard as the murderer and make people throw open the doors to the empty room in the Tower? Henry was also, unlike both Richard III and Henry Stafford, never mentioned by contemporaries or near contemporaries as a possible suspect. Henry Tudor certainly had a motive for killing off the boys, or at least making them disappear, but he didn't have the means or opportunity. He was too far away to attempt anything in England, and he didn't have many people there who could do something on his behalf, except for one person. And this brings us to probably the least likely of the theories and suspect number 4, Henry's own mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, Countess of Richmond. She was certainly Henry's #1 fan, and this idea has been popularised in historical fiction. Was she really the murderer? Let's take a look at the evidence. As mentioned, Margaret Beaufort was very close to the royal family of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville and knew the children very well. She would have spent a lot of time with them, as her fourth husband, Thomas Stanley, Earl of Derby, was steward of the household for Edward IV and a member of the King's Council. This meant they were always at court, and Margaret was made a lady-in-waiting to Elizabeth. She apparently got on well with both the new queen and the royal children. She would have seen them day in and day out and probably was fond of them. This makes it difficult to believe, years later when Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury were in the Tower, that she would have given the order to kill them. However, there is the argument that she would have done almost anything to help her son Henry, but this does seem out of character. Aside from being known as a maternal figure who cared for the royal children, Margaret was also extremely religious, and probably wouldn't have wanted to risk her immortal soul by partaking in the murder of 2 young boys. There's also the practical consideration that at the time the boys went missing, Margaret had no desire to help her son become king, only to return him home and to his title of Earl of Richmond. Making the princes disappear wouldn't have helped that at all. There's also no evidence of her part in events, no contemporary suggestion of it, and Margaret has no motive, means, or opportunity to be a real suspect. However, what if there was another, more outlandish theory about Margaret? Before the prince's disappearance, people didn't just sit around and wait to see what would happen. There was at least one recorded rescue attempt in July of 1483, when several buildings around London were set on fire to keep the authorities busy while the boys were helped to escape from their confinement. Unfortunately, something went wrong with the plan and no rescue occurred. After this point, the boys were not seen again. But what if there was another rescue attempt? One that went very, very wrong. It is possible that there may have been another attempt at rescuing the princes, probably before September, when those rebelling against Richard III decided to throw their lot in with Henry Tudor, something they would not have done had they thought the boys were still alive. Is it possible that a rescue was planned and went wrong? Maybe the princes were attacked by guards who didn't realise who they were in the dark. Perhaps they fell from a high wall while climbing over. In other words, was there an escape that ended in their accidental deaths? This would allow for their complete disappearance, and also for Richard III to not have a clue where they had gone, hence his silence for 2 years on their whereabouts. But who would have funded such a mission, and why? One possibility is Margaret. She was a wealthy woman by this point, and so she had the means to pay for people to carry out the rescue. Also, by this point, she was sending letters to Elizabeth Woodville, who was in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her daughters. Remember that the idea of Henry Tudor becoming king still wasn't formed yet, but Elizabeth needed as much help as she could get to ensure the safety of herself and her remaining children. The marriage of Henry and Elizabeth of York may originally have come with another condition, that of getting Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury out of the Tower. Margaret knew the boys well, and her son Henry was in Brittany, a perfect place to send 2 small boys disguised as nobodies and keep them safe. And once Elizabeth Woodville knew they were safe, she could help with Henry's return to England. But when the rescue attempt went wrong, Margaret had to cover her tracks, because if Elizabeth blamed her for the failed rescue, Henry would not get the help he needed. Those who had been involved would naturally keep quiet to avoid being executed or worse, and Richard III was baffled. However, he still wouldn't have been able to say anything, because the boys were under his protection and he was therefore responsible for them. So that last theory was all conjecture with no evidence to back it up. But it is an interesting one to explain both the prince's disappearance and Richard's silence on their disappearance. But there is at least one other crazy theory going around, one that's only happened in recent years. The Missing Princes Project, a project set up to investigate the disappearance of the princes, claimed to have discovered in 2021 evidence that Edward V had lived out his days in a rural Devon village named Coldridge. They found documents relating to a man named John Evans who appeared in 1484 but was immediately given an official position and the title of Lord of the Manor. He also commissioned stained glass windows in the local church depicting Edward V and other Yorkist symbols around 1511, which was very unusual for the location. So, had Edward V been found? And if so, why was he in Devon? And what happened to his brother? The idea of whether it was really Edward or not is more than a little shaky. John Evans could just as easily been a wealthy local who did well and became Lord of the Manor. And while it reads as he appeared in 1484, actually he could simply have not turned up in records until that time. Medieval records are often patchy at best and missing at worst, and it could be that John Evans had lived in Coleridge since his birth. He could also have come from a family of Yorkist supporters and felt it was safe in 1511 to publicly show this, but not before. But let's pretend it was Edward V. Why was he in Devon? Well, no answer really makes any sense. The boy was only in danger from those who supported Richard III, and as he was meant to be under his uncle's protection, moving him from the tower shouldn't have been necessary. It's also not likely that a boy of 12 who knows he is the king's son and rightful king of England would quietly go and live in Devon and never speak up about who he really was. And finally, the theory simply does away with Richard of Shrewsbury altogether, giving no ideas about why he wouldn't have gone with his brother. So we come to the end of our armchair investigation. We still have 4 suspects, but where do we place them? There aren't really any wrong ideas, except maybe aliens did it. But most theories are still valid in view of the lack of evidence. But here's my conclusion. First of all, as much as my romantic heart wants to believe the princes escaped and ran off to have a life in Europe somewhere, it's not the most likely outcome. It's far more likely they died either through murder, illness, or accidental death. I don't actually believe Henry VII or Margaret Beaufort had anything to do with the disappearance, for very different reasons. There is no evidence at all linking Margaret, and she is only theorised due to the idea circulating in historical fiction. And if Henry VII had done anything, he surely would have used this against Richard III. Equally, even if Margaret had helped the princes escape and this had ended in disaster, she still would have told Henry, who again would have used this to his advantage. It's not to say Henry wouldn't have been capable of it. He certainly proved he was ruthless at getting rid of rivals later on. I just don't think he had the opportunity. Which leaves either Richard III or Henry Stafford. And controversially, I don't actually think it was Richard III directly, at least not on his own. Just like Henry VII, I think Richard was absolutely capable of killing off his nephews or ordering someone else to do it, but I don't think he would actually have been politically stupid enough to simply make them vanish. I believe he and Henry Stafford had an agreement that while Richard was away in the north, giving himself an alibi, Stafford would kill the princes and make it look like they died of an illness. However, perhaps this is where things got messy. Maybe the boys woke up when their murderers entered the room and things moved too quickly for a careful killing. Maybe poison was going to be used, but they couldn't get access to give it to the boys. Something went wrong, and the boys' bodies could no longer be shown in public, because it would have been obvious they were murdered. They couldn't even risk saying these bodies were contagious, because their mother or someone else might have wanted to see them anyway. So the only option left was to hide the bodies and tell Richard on his return. Richard was furious that the boys were dead and he couldn't pretend their deaths were natural, so he had no choice but to stay quiet on the subject, and he and Stafford fell out. Why didn't Stafford say anything? Well, he was involved too. So, that's my personal opinion, but like I said at the beginning of the video, everyone's opinions are valid until proven otherwise. But I still think the suspects are either Richard III or Henry Stafford, or both of them working together. And ultimately, whatever actually happened to the princes in the tower, Richard III was responsible for their welfare. Hopefully one day in the not too distant future, DNA testing might be allowed for the 2 sets of skeletons that have been found, and we can get a step closer to the truth. But until then, it's an enduring mystery which still captures our imaginations over 500 years later. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.